Right. Okay, thank you all very much. So I'm going to be talking about modelling outbreaks, and everything we've heard this morning has all been at the very, very detailed scale. Nothing I'm going to talk about is that detailed. As we heard first, I think it's very awkward to know even about the transmission risk within this room. And so I'm very much taking things at a much, much larger scale. But I'm going to try and talk you through. So I was tasked with the idea of talking about just general epi modelling, but obviously I'm going to focus quite strongly on COVID. But I thought I'd take you through sort of some of the early steps that I tend to do in my head when we're thinking about this. I ought to say there's a massive team behind this, and I'm going to do my thank yous at the beginning so I don't forget them at the end. There's a massive team in Warwick, some of whom are in the audience today. We also interact with a great team out in Kenya, trying to do a similar thing for Kenya, which is even worse because the data is even worse than we've got in the UK. And also the JUNIPER consortium that you've heard about, Julia talked about it, fantastic team of researchers. I also want to thank the SPI-MO people who've sort of kept me on the straight and narrow for a lot of this. And yeah, this really has, most of what you'll hear has been a collaborative effort influenced by lots and lots of individuals. So the starting point, when anyone says to me, epidemic, you know, can you go away and model it? The starting point is almost always a sort of an SEIR type framework. Hugely successful ever since sort of Kermack and McKendrick in the 1920s through to Anderson and May in the 90s. There may be things that we want to think about. Do we want it deterministic? Do we want it stochastic? You know, this is going to depend on the size of the outbreak. Do we want it individual based? But generally there's some epi bit within it that's sort of the SIR model. The other bit, and quite a few questions have come across this in the audience, is there's an inference. There's a, how do we fit that to our data? And throughout, I think we've always got to remember that we need very, very high quality statistical inference to be able to work out what parameters go into this model and how we sort of capture that. So data, I feel, has always got to lead. So it's great building a model, but unless you can fit it to data, it's pretty useless. What then gets bolted onto this? So I think of this as a bit of a jigsaw and we start bolting things on. So the next step I would say is getting the sort of the period right. So what does the latent and the infectious period look like? Actually, that sounds really simple, but there's a vast amount of work that goes into this. And this really is about translating things like the growth rate, which you can measure relatively easily, into things like the R value. So we've all heard about the R value during COVID, but that really critically depends not just on the mean values for how long you're infectious for, but also the distributions. Again, inference is always going to feed in. We then probably want to fit other things in as well. Usually the next thing is age structure or risk structure in some ways. Age is good, because generally we can estimate how old someone is, or you can ask how old they are. Other things that you might want to put in, like risk in terms of occupation, contacts, home life, everything else is a bit more complicated to measure. And mixing matrices are good because people have done the work before, things like polymod, to try and tell us about how different ages mix. So that's a very important thing that fits in. We might then, we've heard a lot about sort of spatial structure. We might want to think about this in terms of real space. My personal models only go down to regions. I have 10 regions that break up the whole of England, sorry, the whole of the UK. And we might want to think about network structure. So monkeypox, we're thinking about sexual contacts. We might want to think about households. There's still an awful lot of work to be done to understand how people mix within a household. So lots of different things that we can bolt on. And then we think about bespoke things. So this can either be targeted at the infection. So we might want to think about strain structure. We might want to think about new variants, or it might be things targeted more at the human population, things like ethnicity, travel history, deprivation. There's a lot of other components that we can build in. And throughout all, and then there's always going to be a missing element. And we've heard this, you know, there's always been that what if you can't capture this, what if you can't capture that? And these models are always going to be caricatures of reality, no matter how much we bolt on. I think there's always going to be little bits missing. And what we've got to hope is that in some ways those are relatively minor compared to the factors that we've included, but also the fact if our inference is good, we can actually subsume a lot of that complexity within some of the parameters that we're measuring. We heard this in the last talk about good coding, and I think good coding and reusable elements is always helpful. So we've got to hope that the knowledge and the code that we've developed in one outbreak is useful when we start thinking about the next outbreak. And the example there is the current monkeypox work, where that's predicated, a lot of what we've done is predicated with what we did years ago, thinking about smallpox, bolted onto things what we thought about for sexually transmitted infections, and we tried to do a mashup. In fact, our models weren't sort of robust enough then, but we've taken the concepts and mashed them together. But what I want to talk about for most of this and thinking about COVID is how the good modelling isn't driven by the model, it's driven by both the scientific questions, the data and the policy. So there's this famous quote that no battle plan ever survives contact with the enemy. And I think this is also very, very true for a pandemic. We can have all these grandiose ideas of what we're going to do in the early stages, but as soon as you start to see the data, as soon as you start to learn something, you have to adapt those very, very quickly. And probably the first thing I used to think of myself as a mathematician, but I'm increasingly thinking of myself as an epidemiologist. And probably the first thing that we do is very, very simple statistics. Log linear plots and looking at growth rates is actually of huge importance and probably tells us an awful lot about what we can think of in a policy way. This was true for the swine flu pandemic in 2009. Actually, the growth rate in the UK looked pretty exponential until there was something going on in the last week where it seemed to increase quite rapidly and then dropped exponentially as soon as the kids broke up. And we could compare what was happening in terms of growth rates in different countries to tell us an interesting story. We've done a similar sort of thing with COVID, and Laura's in the audience, and this is her work, and this really is looking at the growth rate locally, what's the exponential growth in time and space, but using Gaussian processes rather than what I did, which was sort of trivially fitting exponentials. However, even when we do very, very complicated analysis, we still do the really simple thing. And those of you that are on SPI-MO will know we did this, is every time we did a projection, we used a simple ruler test. Does it look like an exponential pattern? Is it doing about the right sort of thing? But we have to be careful. So this is some of the data that's coming in on monkeypox at the moment. And some of the early projections were really based on this first line of, oh, look, it's increasing incredibly rapidly. It's now slowing down, and it's probably slowing down even more. So we have to be very careful about reading too much into these early extrapolations. And that's why we need the modelling to really come in. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to really concentrate on COVID. I'm really going to concentrate on the situation in England, simply because it's one complete data set. Not surprisingly, the devolved nations had their own ways of sort of doing the different data. And I'll talk about various things that happened, particularly thinking about different variants, and also thinking about the sort of testing and behaviour that went on. Unfortunately, our testing stream has sort of almost sort of dwindled away since pre-testing was halted. So where did we start? Well, as I said, we always start with a sort of an SEIR type model. So this was really driven by the data. So I'm going to think about which components driving things, and this is wave one, early dynamics. It's really driven by the fact that the data is about severe disease. We knew some things at the time, so we knew it wouldn't be a simple sort of single E class, single I class. We knew there was going to be more complex things there. So we've got multiple E's, which try and get this distribution of infectious and latent periods right. We knew there was asymptomatic individuals. So we split the population up. And then we really needed to be able to think about severe outcomes, because that was what we got the data on. Most of the data was about hospitalizations, ICUs, and unfortunately deaths. We also had some idea that there was some spatial heterogeneity, so not at this really local fine scale, but certainly we were getting data in at the NHS regions, and so we had to think about splitting up the population into different regional classes. But more importantly, we had to think about splitting the population up into ages, because we knew for COVID that age was hugely important. We know that older individuals had a higher risk of severe outcomes and had a higher risk of being symptomatic rather than asymptomatic. So we've now got, instead of just one class, we've got 7 classes for the different NHS regions and further 21 multiples of that to try and capture the different age classes. So we're already at quite a big system. We also did a little bit of a tweak to the standard sort of, and this is going back to sort of an SIR type model. We also did a bit of a tweak to try and capture some of the policies that were happening at the moment. So we knew that lockdown had come in and there was this, lots of household isolation for individuals that were feeling ill. Problem is if you just put that into a standard sort of SEIR type model and you start sort of ratcheting down the level of external transmission, which is what's shown on the x-axis, you'll just get a reduction in the growth rate. But because we're not explicitly modelling households, and maybe this is where we should go to an IBM type approach, that the fact that there's a lot of mixing between adults within households percolates out that there's just a lot of transmission within the models. So we actually did a lot of early work just trying to capture that sort of household component, with the fact that we knew that once isolation came in, you weren't getting further transmission outside that household if it quarantined. So we've got approximate ways of putting that into our fairly basic sort of set of equations. And we did this sort of, this was starting sort of early. We've sort of really started doing this, thinking about it in sort of February, March time. By sort of April, May, we got this running. We were fitting it on a weekly basis. And really our concern was sort of how we were going to sort of relax out of lockdown. We knew that this was going to be a problem. All our models said, well, it's great, if things are going down, but somehow we've got to get out of this situation at some point. So we thought about different levels of control during the second half of 2020. And then we thought, well, by 2021, we're going to relax all controls completely. We know no outbreak's going to last more than 9 months. I mean, it can't possibly go on that far. And what we found was really a moderate degree of NPIs in the latter half of 2020 seemed to be good, minimised the total outbreak size, but still led to 150,000 deaths. We're now sitting at about 160,000, so we might sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, didn't we do well? But actually this was before we'd thought about vaccination, it was before we knew anything about variants. So we won't over-congratulate ourselves in trying to sort of predict the future too much, but at least we got a model that was matching relatively well to the data. Taking things forward a bit more, sort of when wave 2 hit, we really came into thinking about lots of other components. So the first thing was vaccines. And the policy question at the time was, how should we use the vaccines? And the data was, well, back in October when we got asked this, October of 2020, we knew almost nothing about the vaccines. So we thought about this, adding vaccines basically doubles the number of states in our system. We need to think about individuals either starting off as susceptible or vaccinated. And we need to have a completely separate compartment because being vaccinated changes your risk of moving between all the other groups. You're less likely to be symptomatic, you're less likely to have severe outcomes. As I said, we didn't know anything about the vaccine, so we thought about different ways that the vaccine could act, and we've got sort of 3 different types of vaccine, depending on what we thought it would do. Would it block transmission, which is the hope, so you just can't get infected, or partially block transmission? Would it just reduce your disease, so you catch it, but you're not as likely to be symptomatic? You maybe could still spread it slightly being asymptomatic. Or would it just stop severe disease but have no impact on transmission? And so we looked at different ways, and all of these fortunately came out with the same answer, which was good, which was target the old people first. I mean, in some ways, once you're told this as an answer, it seems pretty intuitive that you target the ones that are going to have the biggest impact if they get infected. But at least it said that this was a consistent pattern throughout all the different types of vaccine. Being given in different ways. Where do we actually live? Well, we're probably somewhere between the two because, well, we're somewhere 1.5-ish, I would say, just in the way that the vaccines act. Okay, I'm going to go slightly quicker. The other thing that came out then was variants. Why have I got Christmas decorations around it? Because I now associate Christmas with variants, because it seems that the last 2 years I've had Christmas Day off, but either side of that I've been working on the latest variant that came in. This was Alpha, this year it was Omicron. So the new variant needed to be added to the model. Effectively, we doubled the number of states again. The data's coming in, fortunately, from some fantastic coincidence that S genes failed for Alpha. So we suddenly had this mechanism of being able to see this new variant without actually going through a lot of the complicated genomics that we might need. We now had sort of effectively 6 copies of our basic model. So we've got sort of alpha and wild type. We've got 1 dose and 2 doses of the vaccine. So we were doing an awful lot of complexity there. And we started to think about what the future could hold. So again, it was how do we get out of a lockdown situation? So we're now in January of 21, and we were in the middle of yet another lockdown. And basically the answer that we came out with was, well, you've got to take things slowly. You can't just have a big crash and take out MPIs, so non-pharmaceutical interventions, all of a sudden. Otherwise, you're going to be in a really bad situation, because we thought everyone would just go to the pub on the first day and therefore things would take off. What that led to was thinking about doing this roadmap out of lockdown, or this roadmap of relaxation, where there was a general trend of sort of fitting the model and trying to project forwards. This is an example from roadmap 2. We didn't do too badly at getting the very early behavior, but this was before we knew anything about Delta. We were fitting here from a downward slope. So actually, getting the fact that it was coming up was not too bad. By the time we were at roadmap 4B, so I've put this one up. So this is the second 4, because the first 4 was delayed. We were doing an awful lot better. The thing that we realized by then is that actually, if you open the pubs, everyone doesn't go on the first day. I mean, that was our initial assumption, that everyone would react very, very quickly to any of these step changes. But actually, people are much, much slower and much more precautionary. And, there's still people in the audience wearing masks, for example. So there's this sort of idea that there's a legacy there that we needed to try and capture. So we had to think about that in quite a lot of detail. If we come sort of more up to date and we think about the Omicron models, and again, this was another Christmas special, we suddenly moved into a scenario where, yes, we've got another variant, so that's another class to add, but actually, we suddenly began to realize that vaccines were waning. So we suddenly have these other classes of waning immunity, both from natural protection or infection-derived protection and vaccine-derived protection. Plus, we'd also got booster doses. There was, as we move through this, we start building up the complexity, both in response to policy and in response to models. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm going to skip over that one just to sort of do lessons learned. So my first lesson for the next pandemic is please develop a very thick skin. Model projections are always getting placed out there. They're always going to be scrutinized. They're always going to be compared. And most importantly, they're always going to be criticized. I think we're always going to be in a situation of not being able to predict human behavior. We couldn't predict the Euros. Maybe with hindsight, we knew people were going to celebrate, but we couldn't predict how long England was going to stay in the football. We couldn't predict the pandemic. We probably couldn't have predicted that when Chris Whitty in December sort of told everyone to sort of behave over Christmas, that people would actually do that. They would all take lateral flows, and we got a vast amount of testing, which really did manage to control a lot of the Omicron outbreak. Models are going to be wrong, but hopefully they will be useful. And quite often, when the data doesn't match your model forecast, tells you an awful lot about what's going on. Data's key. So models are absolutely nothing without data. And I think for the next pandemic, we've got to try and use all available sources more, especially genomic and immunological data, which I think has been underexploited. I'd also sort of urge for a more holistic approach. I think it would be fantastic to be able to think about combining health, wealth, well-being, education within a single framework, rather than just these individual components sort of all being treated separately and then trying to be pulled together somewhere else. And teamwork is vital. So in the UK, I've been really, really lucky. We've got SPI-MO, which has been absolutely fantastic. That's integrated the projections. It's taken multiple groups, so we've had shared responsibility, but I've also been really lucky to be part of the JUNIPER consortium, a wider team in Warwick. So my final slide is thinking back to this sort of modelling to support pandemics. So interinstitutional collaboration, pooling skills, and I think JUNIPER has been a fantastic example of that. I think there's tension between science for policy and science for the public. There's been an awful lot of scrutiny of the science that's come out, not just the modelling, but other areas. And I think there's a very big difference between what you design to talk to policy and try and answer questions to what you design to try and put out to the general public. Hopefully we'll have suites of models of all different sorts, from sort of IBMs to fairly simple things like what I deal with. And those can be used as the building blocks for the next outbreak. Stats and inference methods are vastly important. I think that's a huge area of growth where we need to put more effort in. And then finally, data. I mean, as a caveat, as a modeler, I will always want more data. When someone says, what data do you want? My answer is always all of it. But I think each of our insights during COVID-19 has really been due to new data becoming available. Things like vaccine efficacy, S-gene target failure, waning immunity, repeat infections, all these things that we've learned about come from the data. And in an ideal world, we would have seamless access with things like UKHSA, NHS, other data providers. So it'd be fantastic to be able to sort of have this in some sort of secure data warehouse where we can access this all and run more and more complicated simulations. Things seem to be moving in that direction, but hopefully that will be more in place by the time we have the next pandemic. And hopefully by then I will be retired and it will be up to the younger generation to deal with it all. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, Claire, if you don't mind passing at the top there.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Cool talk. You mentioned, I was interested to hear that you thought that the genomic data had been underutilized. And like, as you know, it's sort of what I'm interested in. I was like, what do you think that a policy response where the genomic data was properly used, or a general response whether the genomic data was properly utilized would look like? Like, what do you envision when you say that?
What do I envision? I mean, I think one of the things that we had problems with the genomics, at least from a personal point of view, I found that, you know, things like S-gene data for looking at new variants was just so much faster, more accessible, a lot easier. And maybe it's just about having those links with things like CogUK that can pipeline the data in. So I'm now having exactly the same problem thinking about BA4 and 5. And actually, you know, what I really want is someone just to give me a raw number. You know, we've done this many tests and X% of 4 and 5. And that's sort of the information that can easily feed into my model. So I think it's about having that data and having it timely, having just an access point that we can get into. So I think a lot of it's about timing rather than anything else. I think also, you know, it would be really, really interesting to think about that in more detail for what's happening within you know, let's take a university, for example. Could you sort of genotype what's happened through, you know, as an outbreak goes through a closed population, or relatively closed population like that, to actually look at the transmission. And that's been done to some extent, but I don't think it's been exploited quite as fully as it could have been.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Matt. Super interesting. It was really interesting to me to see the growth of the model in just the sheer dimension of it. So from a technical point of view, I'd like to ask, so when you add a new dynamic to a model, sometimes over a wide parameter range, the answers that you're getting are really just the product of the two things that you put together. So the epidemic model and, let's say, the trade-off between two variants. And other times you get a complicated interaction between the two pieces, and and you genuinely need all of that extra dimensionality to capture it. Do you have a sense for as you've added these ingredients, where on that spectrum the COVID model sits?
I think probably closer to the former. I think a lot of it, once you've got a new variant in, well, you can just have a model for that new variant and you don't need anything else. But in the point where you switch from one variant to the other, it's important to have both in. And I think having both in really informs, it allows you to pull things out of the sort of data. It allows the inference to work better, I think is what I'd say. So I think quite often there's some measure of complex interaction as you switch between variants. And I think that is most important for the inference rather than for the projections in a way. Because I think once it's in and going, you know what's happening. But I think in the early stages, it helps you learn things about sort of how fast it's going to turn over. For example, is Omicron actually just that much faster, or is it spreading better, or what's the characteristics? And I think there we learned a lot by having that extra dimension within the system.
Thank you.
Can I do a policy question as well while I've got the mic? Did the model actually change policy? So was there an occasion when it made a prediction that was like, oh, we weren't expecting that, now we need to really do something different with the government policy? Ooh, that's a tricky one. I think it did. I mean, certainly it helped to reinforce things. So, I mean, the classic example I can give is, the delay that happened for step 4, because Delta had come in, we knew things were exponentially increasing. Actually, did the model change things? Well, it told us how uncertain we were. And it really said that, we're in a position where at the moment we cannot make very clear predictions or projections that tell us we're not going to have a bad outbreak. And I think, could you have done that without a model? Possibly, but I don't think you'd have had the confidence that we had. And it's an odd thing to say, we were confident how uncertain things were. But I think that's actually quite a useful thing to be able to tell people that actually at the moment, we don't know how safe it is. And it's a bit like the BA4-5 question at the moment. We know things are going up and we know sort of what's happening from South Africa, but from just the UK data, it's not very clear when things are going to turn over. And I think that's the sort of situation we're in with Delta.
I think we had one question here.
Hi, thank you for an excellent talk. Can I just ask you a little bit more about your thoughts on not being able to predict behaviour? Do you think that's because we can't, or we don't yet have good enough data on behaviour?
I think I hate to say this, I think it's a mixture. So, I mean, Ed's the person to talk to, and Ed will be talking about this, talking somewhat more about sort of interactions between models and data. Tomorrow, is it? Yeah. But my take on it is that there's some things that we should be able to do. So we should be able to sort of say, well, actually, we know that when the media starts putting out lots of stories about there's a new variant, we don't know how bad it is, that people might react slightly differently. I think to some extent, there's also a point that you might not be able to do it, because it could be that if you take public sort of account, if you take into account what the public's going to do, you go, oh, there's a new variant, the public's going to panic. In which case the message probably goes out, actually, it's not going to be that bad because we know you're all going to panic, which then means they don't panic, so it's going to be worse. So you could actually end up in a situation where the models influence what the public's going to do in such a way that you can't put out a self-consistent message. So I think it's complicated, and I think there's some parts that we should be able to do. We know now how slowly people relax, but quite when people panic might be a little bit more complicated.
Thanks very much again to Matt and to all the speakers in this session. With all the great questions and talks, you've used up all of the discussion time, so I think we're going to go straight to lunch. Yeah. But I don't know what that is.
Yes, lunch is upstairs, I believe, where you're having more coffees, and we're due back.